All right, everybody, hopefully you guys had a good chance for lunch and you're not going to fall asleep in the middle of our conversation on this. One thing that I wanted to note is that you're probably going to hear a lot of similar themes from some of the folks that are presenting here. And that's a good thing, right? Because it means that whereas in the past, there was almost no discussion of how journalists could be equipped to do storytelling in a way that was informed and aware of trauma, that there's a lot more of that going on now. Doesn't mean that we're there yet, but trainings like this will really help us. So I'll start with just like really quickly telling you a little bit about myself. So I've been a journalist for more than 20 years. And in that time, I've also been an instructor at Kent State University, which is where I graduated from, and also for End Violence Against Women International, which is an organization that focuses on multidisciplinary training of police, prosecutors, sexual assault advocates, nurses, all coming together to do training, as well as doing some training with journalists and the media for all of those disciplines. And also the DART Center for Journalism and Trauma. If anyone here has not heard of the DART Center, it's a really, really great resource for journalists. Not only do they have a lot of tip sheets and information for journalists who are covering trauma, but they also recently in the past year started a program where they are training therapists and counselors across the country to do specific help, specific counseling for journalists who cover trauma. One of the things that we had realized, many of us that do this, is that there are folks that have a lot of training for people who work in advocacy, people who are first responders, but there was very little training for how to work with journalists, where sometimes folks would say, oh, you just need to take a break from this. And journalists would be like, yeah, that's not gonna work. I have this job, I have to go do this. And so folks, the more they learned about journalists, the more they were able to help them navigate dealing with trauma. So I'm also a contributing editor for the Marshall Project, which is a national nonprofit which focuses on criminal justice. And we just opened our first local newsroom in Cleveland, and one of, I think, 5 that will open in recognition of the fact that some of the most impactful journalism that you can do is at the local level when it comes to change. And I also am helping launch Signal Cleveland, which is a new nonprofit newsroom in Cleveland, built around Cleveland Documenters, which trains and pays residents to go to public meetings. Taylor, do I have to tell you when to change the slide? Or that's all that information, so we'll go on to the next one. So one of the things that I wanted to start with, because I feel like earlier today, and you can go on to the next one, sorry. I think, earlier today, we were hearing a lot of things that are general, right? We know this about survivors. We know this about, people who have experienced sexual assault. And so one of the things that I always try to tell folks is that each source that you may talk to as a journalist who has experienced trauma is unique. And that means that, they all come from different walks of life. Some folks may have experienced trauma that was perpetrated over time. Some folks may have experienced trauma that was perpetrated by a loved one or by a stranger. And some folks may have experienced trauma in a generational way, right? And so when we think about this, we can use some of these techniques, but really we need to spend time to learn about the individual who we are collaborating with on a story if we want to do a good job. And I say that, and I use this photo here, and I wanted to say, just like Tamara did, that each of the survivors who I might talk about in this presentation, they know that I would be using information about their story or their case. And, in most cases, I've had long-term, relationships with them, kept in touch. And some of them have done trainings on their own or contributed to trainings on their own. I'd start off with this picture of Johanna Orozco, who some folks may recognize from her story being told in The Plain Dealer. It was really the first story that I had ever done that really involved a significant amount of trauma that was going to be a much deeper story, and also working with someone very young who had experienced a significant trauma and whose family had really had generational traumas. All of that coming into play for me as a reporter who was in my early 20s was very overwhelming, right? I really didn't know how to handle it, but what I recognized right away is that I needed some help in handling it because I did not want to work with someone who had already sustained a significant harm and then do more harm, even though Joanna very much wanted to be a part of telling the story and wanted the story to happen. So I reached out to counselors and therapists and folks and really do my work, asking what were the best ways we could do this. And I got a lot of good advice, but I also had some folks that were really honest with me that told me that there's really no way you can do this that does not cause distress, right? And so we started talking about the difference between distress and re-traumatization, right? So if we think about that, we may have things that happen to us and something might remind us of that, or it might cause us to be quite upset. And being quite upset and dealing with something and working through it and being truly like re-traumatized, where we're going through what we went through the first time, again, those are slightly different things. So I started to try to really think about, what is the difference there? And one of the things that was different to me was the level to which someone was able to make choice in the storytelling. The more that someone knew about the process, the more choices they had, the more we acknowledged that there could be distress and talk about how to work through it and strategize a better job that I felt we could. So we talked about this a little bit. I think each presentation, for those of you that were here earlier, some of you may be just popping in this afternoon. So we're going to go over this just quickly again, because it's really important in this journalism. And we all have different backgrounds. So I wanted to step back and just kind of quickly frame some of the what we're talking about when we talk about trauma. So trauma is a biopsychosocial experience. You have to practice fast a bunch of times when you're teaching about it. But really, we talk about trauma as if it's one thing, but it affects very different parts of us as people. So when you think about the bio part of it, which is on the next slide, the bio are these kind of biological responses that we've heard about in some of the presentations: the fight, flight, freeze, flag. Our body helps us manage the stress of an environment. This is how we manage state of fear that happens to us in a difficult situation. That could be a situation of violence, or it could even be me standing up here speaking to you guys. If I'm one of the folks that really doesn't like public speaking, my body will do things that will help me manage that. And also I may have a response afterwards, right? So has anyone ever gone and done something where they had to speak publicly and then afterwards they go home and they immediately feel like they have to take a nap because they're so exhausted? Or folks in social situations where you go home and you're like, I need to go to sleep now, I can't handle this anymore. It's your body kind of managing your reaction, and really the chemicals and the hormones that are going through your body during that time. It changes how we respond to things. And as we heard earlier, it changes what we lay down in our memory. And it can cause us problems in normal social situations where once that biological response has happened for us, we may then use that again in normal situations. And people would be like, oh, I don't understand why so-and-so is reacting that way in this normal situation, but their body is kind of primed to react differently. Talking briefly about the psychosocial consequences of trauma. When we think about this, we have to think about it in the way that we might see it as journalists, because that's what we're here talking about today. So we may talk to someone and we see this spectrum of like shame and questioning, right? We talk about that a lot, like victim blaming, but we may see folks sharing that with us, that they are questioning what they did in a situation. Part of that is about what folks see publicly, but part of that can also be internal based on our responses. A deep distrust in people and systems. And the other thing that I want to say is like, this is like a huge range. Each person is different. Some folks may isolate, as a psychosocial consequence of trauma because they feel disempowered. They may get out of their relationships. They may be angry. They may tend towards feeling depressed. Other folks may have different reactions. They may all of a sudden become very social and never want to be alone, right? So we can't put any one reaction on folks, which is why as journalists, it's really important for us to let sources lead us in terms of what they're feeling and understand what those range of reactions can be. I just kind of have this note on some of what I have seen in a trauma survivors universe that might be confusing to reporters, because reporters like to look for patterns and they like to look for things that make sense to them. There's a weird thing about the reporter brain that we want the world to make sense and we want to be able to organize it into boxes that feel normal to us. But that is not the world that we live in, right? And it's part of our training too, right? We want to put everything into an inverted pyramid, and the world is not an inverted pyramid. There's lots of like nuance there. And so I think we can use these understandings to kind of infuse our reporting with some of those things and use our reporting to more fully explain these different things that we see to the public. So you might have folks that intensely remember details, so many details about a situation that involved trauma, or that they're just forgetting all the time, not maybe just about the trauma, but everything else. I mean, anyone who's ever been reporting on something and maybe they're working with a source and they're just like, oh, I just forgot we were going to meet and I forgot. And you're going like, what's happening here? But you have folks that really do have their brains kind of say, I just can't do this. And so you're forgetting details about when you're supposed to meet or what you're supposed to do. Talking about arousal or avoidance, we don't get into the details about this a lot, but our bodies and our minds react so different to trauma, and we could be aroused by certain things or avoid certain things. A lot of times sources don't want to disclose things because they're not sure how people will react to them. Quickly talking about anger and shame, trust and betrayal, but the one that I think is the most important is power versus powerlessness. And I think this is something that a lot of trauma survivors struggle with. On one hand, they really want to show the power that they have over a situation that happened to them, right? At the same time, feel completely powerless to do anything about it, especially when it comes to systems that are in control, right? And the one thing that I recognized is that you may see both of those dynamics in the same person and the same source at different times. But we, again, back to the reporter brain wanting to categorize people, we want to write a story that says someone is very powerful or someone felt very disempowered, as if those are the only two choices. Mm-hmm. People can be on these spectrums. Mm-hmm. The other thing that I always really want to encourage reporters to think about is that a lot of times in our reporting, we focus so much on the deep, deep trauma, right? There's like a part of us that I don't know, it's a bad part of us. It's not bad. It's just a natural part of us that we tend to focus on those type of details. I think about this a lot of times when some like major documentary comes out about a traumatic event or whatever, and we think about what details people choose, right? Mm-hmm. They really choose to highlight vulnerability and the most painful parts of someone's narrative. And then we all kind of lean into that, right? Mm-hmm. But I also think that we do not spend a lot of time focusing on resilience, coping, and healing. And those are the parts that people put a lot of energy into. Mm-hmm. And so as journalists, the same way that we focus on really negative things, whether they're shared experiences or individual experiences, when it comes to resilience, which is this other, counterweight to trauma, we tend to focus on things that seem extraordinary or even fluffy and not realistic. So, we might be drawn to writing a story about a child who was abused or experienced homelessness, and now they're at Harvard, as if going to Harvard is the only way they can show resilience. And that is not the case, right? We all know, at least I hope that we all know that resilience is kind of like a daily thing, right? It's actually, for some folks, it is getting up and just figuring out a way to go to work that day with everything else that they've gone. It's taking these small steps towards becoming either who they were or who they wanted to be. And when we downplay those things or we minimize them, it's really not fair to folks. And it's really not great for readers either, because then it's setting these expectations for resilience that are so high. And also coping and healing. One of the things that I've really tried to think about in doing stories related to trauma, whether it's homicide and loss or sexual assault, is kind of focusing on what that coping and what that healing looks like. Because what I would see as a younger reporter is we would spend lots of words, lots of words in a story, describing an actual traumatic situation in as much detail as possible. And then maybe, if we're lucky, throw in 1 or 2 sentences to talk about how someone coped or how someone felt better or what they did to heal. So we're really creating this kind of one-dimensional picture of resilience and healing while creating a much more painful and layered view of what an actual trauma was like. And when you do that, one part sticks in folks' minds more than the other. And so that causes all of us to focus in the place of trauma and not healing and resilience. Just a couple of things that I've noticed as a reporter, and I'm going to go through this quickly because I think other folks have really talked about this a little bit today. But these are things that you have to cope with if you are reporting on something. So I might encounter someone who is hesitant to establish trust, right? That's something we might all think is pretty realistic, right? If I've had something that happened to me and it was very traumatic, I might not have a lot of trust for folks. But I've also encountered folks that immediately are like, you are my person. I'll tell you everything about my life. And in that case, as a journalist, it's really hard because your journalist brain, which I think is kind of similar to the reptilian brain that was mentioned earlier, like, yes, I want someone to tell me everything. When in reality, a better practice is to have a conversation and establish a boundary about what you're telling me and what I might use that information for, so that we're on the same page about this. Because in some cases, I've had sources think, you're the person that's going to understand this. So I really feel comfortable sharing it with you. And I'll say, okay, like, I'm really glad that you're feeling that you trust me and that you want to have an open dialogue. But let's talk about what we do with that information. Let's come up with like a shared agreement on where this goes. And do we need to have a way for you to say, I'm just telling you this for you so that you understand, or I'm telling you this because I would like it to be included in a story. Because I don't think we can assume that those boundaries are understood. We should never assume anything as journalists, but particularly in this case, we have to slow that down and work on that. Sometimes we'll see an emotional disconnection from someone where we're talking about something that's very important. Some people call it the 1,000-yard stare, or an extreme emotional connection. I've worked with sources on stories where that connection is immediate and they're then going to tell me everything by text every 5 minutes. And that's again where we talk about, okay, like, what are the boundaries for this? What works for you? What works for me? And I feel like one of the best things for me has been being real practical in those conversations, and not being very emotional about those conversations and doing a lot of explaining. And for reporters, that can be difficult. For me, sometimes that includes like sharing personal things, which a lot of reporters aren't comfortable with. Well, I'll say to someone, I'm really glad that you feel comfortable sharing this with me and that you're texting me. I also just wanted to let you know, I do have 3 kids, so I might not respond after 6 because I need to be taking care of them and tending them to them. Mm-hmm. If it's an emergency, you can definitely let me know. But otherwise, I just want you to know I will be reading what you send, probably just not what you send. So I think setting those kind of co-boundaries is really helpful. Some of the other things that we see is, we talked about this, and we'll talk about this more later, about holding a storyline together or telling a narrative, oversharing of intimate details, right? Mm-hmm. So sometimes you'll ask someone a very simple question and you'll get a lot of details and you'll say, I'm not really sure what to do with these details. And that's where you have a conversation about that. And then the other thing we talked about is the reactions that might seem out of place. So this is something that journalists have really benefited from training that's really intended for detectives or prosecutors to understand someone's reactions when you're interviewing them. So I've noticed a lot with younger survivors, especially, there might be a tendency that, I think we heard a little bit of this earlier, to laugh or giggle. Anybody, I'm thinking most folks that I'm looking at in front of me are a little bit younger than me, but I have an 18-year-old, and whenever she was in trouble, there was often like an uncomfortable laugh or giggle. So I think that that's a normal thing, and we just have to recognize that, but also don't make an assumption. And as a reporter, we can say something like, "Oh, like I see that you're giggling. Are you feeling kind of nervous right now about sharing this?" Or just like ask questions about someone's reaction rather than an assumption about it. So I think when we as journalists think about what we notice and then how to figure out what it means, we can do a better job in reporting on stories like this. So another thing that journalists can keep in mind is that we may have our own trauma histories or experiences. There can be a tendency, if you do, to connect your own experiences and reactions to other people's, and you have to be real cautious about that. Quite a few journalists that I know, especially who are women, do have something in their history that makes them want to be a storyteller or gravitate towards trauma. It's up to each person whether they want to share that with someone or not, and when that is or isn't appropriate. But you need to know it, and you need to think about, what was my reaction versus what is this person telling me? What is their reaction? We also may have this distress from vicarious trauma. We're going to talk a lot more about that later, so I'm not going to spend a ton of time on it now. But the hardest part, if it runs counter to like understanding the range and reactions. And for me, I remember early on, I was doing a lot of stories on sexual assault, and I was really struggling, right? Really, really struggling and feeling very angry a lot. So I think I kicked filing cabinet one time and other things like that. And Tamara brought this up earlier, this term moral injury. And it took me I don't know, a good 15 years into my career as a journalist until I heard this term. But I was really glad when I did, because what I learned from that is that a lot of times when you're talking about trauma, what you'll hear from folks is that your proximity to this trauma is causing you vicarious trauma or distress. And sometimes that is absolutely the case. So you taking in details and scenes and having to understand them so that you can describe them can cause you that vicarious trauma. But moral injury to me felt very different. It was an anger that would bubble up when we would do this work and we would write these stories and we would support, survivors and talk about policy, and then nothing would happen, or at least it appeared in the moment that nothing would happen. And so to me, that was where that moral injury comes in. I think a lot of folks in advocacy experience this sometimes, where you're like, we did all the things and the system still didn't change. And that's really hard to deal with and recognize, but it is a different thing. One of the things that really, like an aha moment for me, I feel like my learning happens in aha moments often when I'm not expecting it, was I was watching a documentary on PBS, and it was about the making of 9 to 5, which was a movie with like Dolly Parton and everything, working women. And what I didn't know when that movie came out, I thought it was just kind of like a silly movie with like Dolly Parton. Was it actually based on the working women's movement? So it was women in Cleveland and Seattle and all of these places who were coming together and trying to make it clear that they were not going to accept office behavior, which is what they called it at the time, which were things like their boss touching their butt, or being told to, pick up someone's child or do their dry cleaning, just very demeaning behavior in offices. Mm-hmm. And some of it was through, just coalition building and education. Some of it was through trying to build unions so they could actually establish rules. There was so much work done. There were protests. There were, all of these folks that got together. It was a very collaborative group. It was like folks from all different like races and jobs, people that worked in like banks and people that worked at local community colleges. They put a lot of work in. And then, we had a president elected, President Ronald Reagan, and there was a national labor board that came into place that made change in the workplace very hard. And a lot of these women who worked on this so hard, it was mostly women at the time, we were talking like, more than 20, maybe 30 years ago. So we're talking about a very, gendered conversation. And they were deflated, and they felt like they had like failed, some of them, even though they knew they had done good work, right? But when they were being interviewed for this documentary, one thing that I recognized is that their aha moment was that none of the things that came after would have happened had they not done that, right? So the idea of sexual harassment even being recognized at all as a thing, let alone a type of discrimination that's in law, something like a Me Too movement. What we're recognizing that all those things were built on top of the work that they had done, and not that the work was unimportant or didn't do enough just because it didn't achieve the actual goal they had. So for me, when I'm thinking about moral injury, I go back to that place and think, why are we doing what we do, right? We're doing this because we know that things happen that are wrong, and we're going to show people what are happening, and we're going to allow people to be a part of telling their own stories. And we can't really control what happens after that. But often through the lens of time, it's very different. Anything where change is involved is really a movement. And so movements don't all happen at once. That's one of the kind of coping mechanisms that I think about when I think of moral injury, is knowing that we never know in the future what will happen with the work that we're doing now. I'm going to pause really quick, just from the basic stuff on trauma, talking really fast. Folks just had lunch, and see if there's like any questions rather than just waiting all the way to the end. I thought we would pause in the middle to see if there's any questions so that people don't have to keep them in their brains to the end before I move on to some more practical stuff.
I'm not sharing my screen. Huh? It's not on full screen. I just don't see my Zoom controls at all. Sorry, y'all. I just want to make sure we are.
I don't see any questions. Okay, I'm ready to move on if we get that back on the screen.
Okay. On your screen, Jen, can you see this? Okay, cool. We're good.
So we should be on the slide that says create trauma aware practice. So one of the words that I use a lot now when talking about training is practices, because I feel like everything that we do, it's like feels like one story at a time, but we can build in practices that we use. And so we all have this kind of push and pull. You know, we're often drawn to these stories of trauma because our brain wants to understand what we're trying to learn about. And we have narratives about trauma in terms of what shouldn't and can't or won't happen to us. I think when we build in practices, we can make sure that we are doing the best job that we can, rather than taking each story on a story by story basis. I have encountered a lot more folks recently, particularly students in classes that I've had or younger journalists, who will say things like, I don't think we should be doing these types of stories. I think that we're going to cause harm to people. And I think that we heard a lot of that in Samara's research, and it can be kind of hard to grapple with, right? I don't think anyone wants to feel the way that she said was feeling after doing those stories. I don't think that practices can solve that problem completely, but I do think that they can help us figure out how to feel better about the jobs that we have to do, and treat people better, and come up with ways where we can do this incredibly difficult work that does have to be done in a way that is sustainable and in a way that causes the least amount of harm possible. Because really, a lot of change won't happen if information doesn't get out there. We're going to talk a little bit about things we can do to prevent some of that harm and distress, and also to manage it if it does happen. There we go. So one of the things that we were talking about briefly over lunch was trust, right? So we're humans, we're all very relational, right? We kind of see ourselves in the context of the world based on our relationships with other people. And so we do this with all sources on some levels. You know, anyone we might talk to for a story, we're always gauging the level of trust that we have and how we interact with folks. But for folks that have experienced a trauma, we have to take even more care with our relationships because of all of the things that we've been discussing, right? And so one of the things that I really talk to folks a lot, and this is difficult, like, news has this sense of urgency. It's always dragging us around, right? As if it's the first priority. I do think as reporters, we can assert ourselves in kind of slowing things down. And it's hard, especially if we're new to doing this, but really talking to even our bosses about like the pace of this work, if we have the right language. So here are some of the things that I think are essential to kind of building trust. One of the things I try to do if I'm initially talking to someone about a story, whether I have contacted them or they have contacted me, is understand their motivation or basically the reason that they might agree to talk to me. And so even if it is a story that you're doing for that day, and this is what I hear from reporters a lot, well, I'm doing this daily story. I don't have a chance to have this conversation. I just have to go in and do it. I would tell them to question that. If you are trying to talk to someone about one of the most significantly, traumatic moments in their life, I think you can spare a couple minutes to talk to them about why they might talk to you or might not, and setting some ground rules for understanding it. When I hear folks tell me that there's not time for that, then you probably just shouldn't even be doing the story, right? And that's hard though, because I think a lot of folks start in this job and maybe if they are younger, they don't know how to talk to a boss about that. And I think that kind of coming up with your language that will help you explain that to someone in advance is really helpful so that you're not trying to be in the moment with your bosses like, you just need to do this. If you know that you can say, it's my practice that I got to take at least 10 minutes to explain to someone what our conversation will be about, where the information is going to appear, what their role is in this, and what their choice points are. I think it is possible. I mean, it's not great to have to do that quickly, but I do think it's possible. So a lot of times when I talk to folks, their motivation, whether it's a short-term story or a long-term story, more likely a long-term story, is like, I want to see this change. I don't want this to happen again. And what I often tell to folks is that I can't promise you if you talk to me and that we tell the story that this will be like a magic wand and everything will change, right? Because that's just not the way things work. Even if you have information that shows a really terrible wrong that was done, unfortunately, that does not mean that will be fixed, right? What I do tell people is that from my experience over time is that it will matter to other people who have had similar experiences that you. So that I feel very comfortable promising folks that, systems very hard to change. Understanding between people is a much more achievable goal. The other thing I think that's important is to be active in understanding and discussing where someone is and how you can do your job without additional harm. So really understanding where someone is at in their kind of experience of, did a trauma just happen to them? Or do they feel like they are further along in their healing? I have had folks that contacted me and said, I really want you to do a story about X. And I'll say, okay, like what's, how long ago did this happen? Like, what supports do you have and stuff? And through that conversation, what I'll end up saying is, I feel like if we wait 3 months, this story still will be very important, but you might be feeling in a better place to tell it. And you'll feel like you're more solid on standing on 2 feet, because I think that urge when you're very much in pain to tell your story can be there, but it might not be the right thing. Now, I'm not there to tell someone, what they should want to do and when, but just even having that conversation, like, do you think you might still want to tell this story in 3 months? Like, could we revisit it together? I've also talked with folks who are very interested in telling a story, and I'll say, well, how about we start out by checking in? Like, let's check in every couple of weeks by email and see how you're doing. And if you feel like you've got the time and that you've got all of your daily things going on in your life in order, then that might be a better time. And we'll start an ongoing dialogue that also gives them the opportunity to reach out to me right? Rather than me checking on them. Sometimes I'll check in on someone if they say, hey, can you check in on me in a couple weeks? But just really like understanding that dynamic of where someone's at that point. And I've had folks that I've done that with, and we've gone back and forth, and maybe we never even write a story, but they just touch base. Say, oh, this is actually how I'm doing, and I participated in this other event, and it felt really great. But it's just a way of kind of measuring what will work for someone. And then when it comes to pace, one thing I always try to talk to folks about is like what the pace of a story would be. On one hand, we worry about talking to someone at 5 o'clock and finishing a story at 9 o'clock, and how difficult that will be, and how we can work through all of the things that are in a story. On the other hand, the opposite spectrum of that is someone coming to you and really investing in telling a story with you. And you may do many, many, many interviews, and the story isn't coming out, and they're feeling very anxious about it. So a lot of times I'll talk to someone like a longer narrative story that could take a whole year to get done. And then what I'll normally do is kind of map out that process for them so they understand what the different parts are. Again, it would feel really weird to someone if they talked to you for hours and hours and hours, and then they didn't hear from you for a little bit, and then they heard from you when it was a huge rush. Okay, we need to answer all these other questions, and the story's publishing tomorrow, right? Imagine how that would feel if that was you, but that's kind of sometimes how we do it as journalists. And so the more front end explaining we can do, the better. And that's on the next slide, I'm kind of getting into that already, is about this transparent process. So one of the things that I do generally for interviewing and also for a long-term story is I have a checklist, and I told Taylor that I'll provide a copy of it for folks. And it really comes from the perspective of like, if you're going to be a source in a story, you can ask questions too. And it's questions that have come up the most often from people who are victims or survivors throughout a story, but a way to kind of bring those up in the front end so you can really talk them through. So we talk a lot about what information might be gathered, how choices will be made about a story, and who will make choices about a story. I think one of the worst things I've ever seen journalists do to survivors is talk to them and be very compassionate and explain to them how choices will be made, and then come back to them and say, I'm sorry, my editor decided this. That's just not a great way to operate. And so explaining to someone upfront as a reporter, here's the choices I get to make, here's the choices my editor gets to make, and here's how we decide about those things with you, is a really good thing to let someone know, because someone might say, well, I don't want some person that I didn't meet making these choices. And then we can say, okay, well, I'll see if my editor is willing to talk to you. Or you can also choose not to participate in the story if that's not the way you want it to go. How and where the story will be published and shared. I think Tamara mentioned this, but in this day and age, stories go everywhere. When I started eons ago, I would turn in my story and it would be printed in the Plain Dealer, and that's the only place people could get it, right? Except for an occasional breaking news story that the AP would pick up. Well, now anyone can go, online to where a story was published and pick in pieces and parts of it and share it anywhere. So I think we have an obligation to kind of share that information with people, that once we publish a story, we don't have total control of it, and neither do they. And if that is going to be an issue for them, you don't want them to figure that out afterwards, right? So what I'll often do when walking through these questions is I'll show people examples of the great things where people shared a story in a really positive way. And I'll show them examples of where someone shared a story in a way that I didn't think was appropriate, but I didn't really have control of besides to call them out on it. I think for folks that have survived traumas, really showing those concrete things is really important, because when we're just telling folks a bunch of words and they don't have anything to look at or refer to later, that's really difficult. Another thing, and this is incredibly hard for journalists, is making it clear that it's okay to walk away at any point. I will say to people, we're going through this together, but at any point, if this becomes too difficult, or it's not the right time, or it's causing you, additional trauma, you can just say, I can't do this right now. And as a journalist, I'll be honest with them. Yeah, that will make me sad, probably. It's always frustrating to do a lot of work and to not be able to publish a story, but having someone be okay is always more important than publishing a story. And so I think that by doing these things up front, you're both making clear the choice points, but you're also doing that building trust thing. Because I've heard a lot of journalists talk about, oh, I invested so much time in a story and then someone ghosted me. I'm like, well, did you have a conversation up front about all of these things? Because usually if someone disappears, they're either experiencing, extreme, trauma, or other things are going on in their lives, or things are happening that they didn't anticipate, right? And they don't know how to say that because you haven't started with this open conversation. Some of the other things that I try to talk about is like, how should we keep in contact? What is the best way for you? Some people need a little distance and they need to be able to contact you. Some folks would like to work through another person, if that's helpful, so they're not getting messages when they're not sure they're coming. And then one of the other things is I always tell folks, like, what questions do you have for me? So I'll say, let's flip the tables for a minute. We've talked about doing the story. I've shared a lot of information with you. You're now going to interview me. What questions do you have? You can ask me whatever you want. And I'll sit there and I'll try to go through and answer whatever questions someone else comes up with. And then I'll also say, you might not think of the questions you have right now, but you can always send those to me later. And I'll answer them for you, whatever way works best. It could be a text, it could be an email, you could have another phone conversation. So I'm going to briefly talk about trauma, memories, and interviewing. We heard a little bit about this already, so I don't want to spend all kinds of time on this, but we can have a conversation about it further if we want to. In this afternoon, we're going to talk a little bit more about interviewing. So for reporters, trauma memories are maddening, but imagine how it feels for a survivor. If you're questioning someone's narrative, they're probably questioning it too, right? So I think about, how as journalists, we can write stories of trauma survivors that kind of reflect this psychological impact of trauma on memory. Other folks that are not journalists, artists, and things like that have come up with really cool ways to represent this. But with journalists, one of the things that we don't do is really incorporate that in our stories. And I think that we would do well by folks for sharing more about it. So we talked about, I think twice today already, how during a traumatic event, our brain is focused on survival. I always laugh at like the reptilian brain when we talk about it. I just imagine this like little reptile, and the brain kind of looks like a reptile. But from the journalist perspective, for us, this is just a jumbled timeline, right? And we need to organize it because we're organizers, we're organizing stories, we're organizing everything. One survivor that I worked with described her memories to me as like puzzle pieces, some in place, some scattered out of order, and some missing. So I really kind of carry that with me and think, how difficult would it be for me to try to tell a story from my own life if I was missing these big pieces? And I think that one thing that we can do is help folks put them back together. And in fact, I would say that it could actually be really healing to help folks put those trauma memories back together. So I'm going to save the rest of the interview stuff for this afternoon and go on to just thinking about how we describe traumas. Oh, there we go. Did I go the wrong way? All right, we're good. So often as journalists, we get stuck on details, but there are details that we think are important. That would be the how, the what, the when, the where, the why. And that leaves out a lot when it comes to the impact of trauma on survivors. And so I wanted to just kind of quickly give 2 examples of how you can incorporate that into storytelling based on what survivors tell you from the narrative that they have retained. So I'll just read this beginning of a section of a narrative story that was published in 2019 about a woman named Sandy Fedor, who was raped in Cleveland and reported her rape to police, and police did not investigate it. And she was very persistent with them over a number of years in forcing them to investigate it. Mm-hmm. She's in that dingy basement again. Everything is drained of color. The smell of simmered sauerkraut overwhelmed her. His voice mocked. She hears it over and over. You're not going anywhere. So on one hand, this morning we were talking about like the dark and stormy night thing. And I was thinking about that when I thought about this beginning in the morning. But, you know, this is different because each element of that paragraph comes from Sandy's own narrative of what she remembered. So one of the first times that we talked, we went kind of very open form, and we'll talk about this later, through what she thought was important and what she remembered. And one of the things she was struggling with was that the kind of flashes of memory that she did have. And she said something like, for some reason, when I try to remember this, everything is in black and white, but clearly it was not in black and white. And I'm only remembering it black. She said that she didn't remember everything about what was happening, but the smell from the food cooking in the house was something that she couldn't forget. It was always with her whenever she recalled any part of the memory of herself, whether that was with her therapist or talking to us. And then she was being asked by like law enforcement and other folks to remember what the perpetrator said to her. But there were only certain bits of it that she clearly remembered. And those bits of it, she would hear a lot. Even when she wasn't thinking about it, she would have this kind of intrusive voice. So what we did was we'd really try to bring that into a story to kind of set what this was like from her perspective, right? And how those things disrupted her daily life. So the rest of that paragraph as it goes on is no matter where Sandy went, all this time later, she felt trapped in that man's house. The memories came in flashes, invasions, as she tried to grocery shop or babysit her grandkids or go anywhere in the car, the one he'd been in. So what we were trying to do is really take what she was experiencing and let other folks kind of feel like what that might be like to have those things intruding on your life. Rather than us saying, you know, you give us a description of what happened to you in all the detail possible, we tried to turn it around and how is she experiencing that in her life? And then one of the other things I was going to bring up as an example is Shanique, this wonderful woman here, who had kind of a story that she's actually the one who, if you see that she's at a Taco Bell, it was actually her idea to take her portrait at this Taco Bell because she just could not get over the fact that her sexual assault decades later was solved because an off-duty officer saw her at this Taco Bell and recognized her from a case he had been investigating and he hadn't been able to find her. And she goes, oh, we have got to take the picture of the Taco Bell. Because for her, it was like the levity was very special. But when I met her, we met at the Cuyahoga County Prosecutor's Office. I was going to be writing a story about her case, and it was, you know, offered to her that she wanted to talk, and we said, well, let's just meet and see if it will be okay. You know, we didn't have any agreement of whether to participate in the story or not. I just wanted her to meet me first and see what she thought. We ended up talking for like 2 hours. I thought we'd be there for 20 minutes. We were there for 2 hours. But one of the things that really stuck with me was how she described what she was going through and that she didn't have the language for, right? And we actually talked about the language for it that day, and I got a bunch of text messages from her afterwards after she had watched all these videos. But she said if she was driving after dark, sometimes she would panic and run stop signs or red lights until she was safe again in her driveway, and then she could breathe again. And so we were just talking, and she brought this up, and I said, oh, there's actually a word for that. And I explained to her, just from my knowledge, I said, you know, as a reporter, I've had to learn about this because I didn't know what it was before. Hypervigilance, you know. And she was like, wait, that's a thing? That happens to other people, not just me, you know. And for her, it was like, you know, it's like the reverse aha moment. I've talked about how I've had all the aha moments, and she had one. And I said, yeah, you know, I feel like there's information on this out there. And before she left, I sent her like a text message with, you know, a video or two. And she's like, oh my gosh, all these years I've been thinking I'm the only person this happened to, and I didn't want to tell anybody this was happening. I even got speeding tickets and then didn't even tell anybody why. And so I think that kind of discussing these things can be really important, and having that back and forth. And so after that, like, we had this whole 2-hour discussion, and then we went through together, like, what level of detail to which she wanted to describe things. And with a detail like that, I said, would you be comfortable including something like that in a story? That was something that you went through in these other years, since this has happened to you. And she was like, yeah, I want other people to know about that. So we talked through it and we discussed it, and that became part of her story, not just what had actually happened to her when she was a teenager. I'm going to go through some of these other slides a little bit more quickly. So I'm going to go long on this. So I want to talk about presenting trauma in context. I think a lot of the things we were saying today about using details of sexual assault, the things that made them problematic was that they were not presented in context. In context is really important. As a journalist, if you've ever been through this, when you're getting edited by an editor, the worst thing they can do is they start to try to cut out all your context, right? They're just like, let's get rid of all these other things. And you're like, no, that's the most important part. That's the context. I think that's what most arm wrestling matches end up with over editing stories like this, is what we know is important and what we hear from survivors are important are the first things that editors want to cut out a story. So a couple things to think about is that it's never fair to define anybody, sexual assault survivors or anyone, based on the most difficult experiences of their lives. So it's really important to take the time to get to know someone as the person that they are and the person that they always were before they went through a trauma. Also recognize that how someone feels about something may change over time. You may have that initial feeling in that moment, and then there's a lot of aftermath and things can change. And so really having that conversation with someone of like, how did you feel at that point? And then what were you going through later? And allow room for how that changes. Avoid cliches and stereotypes. I think there's so many of these in stories about sexual assault where we feel like, again, we're putting them into some kind of box. And portray complexity whenever we can, right? Take that moment to allow someone to be the complex person that they are, instead of the very simplified one-dimensional person that sometimes we want them to be in a story. One of the things that I think a lot from the Sandy story was that, this was a person that had pretty reasonable trauma from a sexual assault. But what we discovered, the more we kind of peeled away in her story, was that the system that didn't actually properly respond to what happened to her was what really made the trauma worse. And a lot of folks, as we're reporting on the story and getting it edited, didn't really understand that. They were like, well, wait a minute. Like, I pretty much think that being raped is the worst thing that could happen. And she kept saying, no, that was terrible. But the worst thing was nobody reacting the way that they were supposed to, because you don't expect like a rapist to be a good guy, but all the other people that you expected to be good and do their jobs weren't doing them. And that for her was worse. So really listening to something like that and putting that in context, I think is extremely important. Talk about some larger context to consider. The more we zoom out, the harder it is to get some of this information into stories, but I think that there's ways to do it. Folks' reactions to trauma can be based on their generational experience, right? A person who's experiencing the first and only significant trauma or violence in their life may react very differently than a person whose family, who personally or whose family has endured repeated traumas, right, throughout their life. And so you learn your coping mechanisms from that, but also your reactions might be that. One of the things that I think about with that are folks that I've reported on that have had a lot of traumas in their lives, and kind of opposite that I would have thought. Sometimes they have better coping mechanisms because they've had more practice, unfortunately, right? That's not a good thing. But I've seen folks that maybe have never had a significant trauma and they're really, really struggling, whereas other folks, they haven't had a choice but to figure out how to cope. And so their reactions are different. And I think that when we're doing stories, we don't always make room for that. We don't make room for explaining things like that. We also don't make room for explaining things like disenfranchised trauma, right? Or racialized trauma. And so one of the things that will always stick with me, and this was a case that was in Cleveland, the Anthony Soul case that I covered and a lot of folks covered, where 11 women were raped and murdered, and 5 more were also were raped or sexually assaulted by Anthony Soul. One thing that was my moment for really recognizing that was when some of the families of some of the women who went missing came out to where everybody was gathered and swarming around the site of his home. And, TV camera flips on, and one of the family members says, someone in the media, of course, asks, like, how do you feel? Which you're just like, no, don't do it. And this family member was just like, I feel like we reported this crime a whole bunch of times, and you guys did a story on someone's Christmas ornaments that were missing, and not my mother, right? And so for me in that moment, you were just like, yeah, this is a totally different thing for them, right? Like, the narrative that was happening in the media and with the police was that, oh, these families, they didn't report their loved ones missing. They didn't, it was all kind of shifting towards that. And this family was like, no, let's put the onus back on where it was. Many of us did report this and were told not to make reports. You all chose to focus on other things. And this is our experience. And so I think as much as we can bring those things into our reporting, that giving that context is really important. And I also think about another survivor of that case, Anthony Soul's case, was Vanessa Gay, who I was able to interview at multiple points, through that case. She was one of the main folks to testify in that case, and had a lot of support, but also still really struggled. And when we talked about 5 years after the case, I asked her, I said, what's the thing that you're still really sitting with, like, to this day, that you want people to know about? And she said, one life is not worth less than another because of what they're doing or the color of their skin. Life is precious, life is valuable. And I said, well, what makes this come up for you? And she said, this is really hard to say, and I don't really want to bring it up like this, but there was another case that happened, and it was some young women that escaped from a house, and they had very bad things happen to them. And I never would have wanted that to happen. When I saw how differently they were treated, it hurt worse. They had lawyers, they had $1 million donated to them. And because I was a Black woman and I had a drug addiction, there was nothing for me. Once they got the testimony they wanted from me, nobody was there. That experience is really important, right? It's really painful. Nobody wants to talk about that, but that was her real experience. So allowing her to discuss that in a way, and it was very delicate, because she's like, I don't want to cause other folks who had harm to feel like I'm speaking against them, but that was my experience. So we had to have a discussion on, okay, exactly how will we share this? That you feel like it represents what you're saying, but doesn't take away from their experience. And we had a good conversation about it. But it was necessary to really show what she went through. All right, I'm gonna go one more, I think. I go to this larger context. Okay, just talking a little bit about framing. In the covering of the sexual assault kit cases, it really took some effort to get to nuance. So one of for me, the most kind of shattering moments was kind of talking to some folks, as a reporter, you're writing stories, and all of a sudden they're going to test 14,000 rape kits, and you're like, this is great, this is going to happen. This is what was needed. And then very shortly after, started talking to survivors who were just absolutely livid. And this was, I think someone talked about opening and closing a lid, that was Tamara. This was so difficult for them, because they were like, how dare you come life 20 years later and tell me you're going to right the wrong that you didn't care about then? And you want me to participate? And what do you to give you some flowers for it? And when I saw that unfold, I was like, oh gosh, like this is that moment where you're like, what did we do? On one hand, so important, because we knew that there were so many folks whose cases hadn't been solved. And on the other hand, extreme amount of pain that you're going to end up causing people, really. So I think you do like what you can do about that. We worked out a process with like prosecutors and detectives to make sure that survivors were notified if we're going to be writing about their stories, so they didn't find out in the paper, and that we had a framework for their participation, or if they didn't want to participate, them actually just reviewing details that might be included so that they knew what they were, or they could dispute them, because we found out that a lot of details that were in police reports from back then, they didn't think were true at all. So I think that all of that is pretty difficult. We're going to go through like 2 more slides, and I'll do it very quickly, and then we can always pick up because I know we're running a little bit late.
Okay. Yeah.
So I'll save the language matters, I think, for when we talk about interviewing. Just going to quickly jump through the editing process. So when we talk about the editing process, we really have to have a conversation about what to use and what needs to be included and what verification is. So a lot of times I'll talk to survivors and say, you're going to tell me a lot of things. And one of the things that journalists do is we try to find as many places where we can verify that information as possible. This is a process that I use whether I'm reporting on a sexual assault or not, right? So I think for folks to know that this process doesn't only pertain to their story, it pertains to every story, is really important. Also coming up with a framework for sharing what you find. In particular, with a story that had to do with Sandy, I was getting all these records of her investigation. And so at each step, I would go to her and say, okay, this is what we got. Is this something that you might want to see? Is this something you want me to explain to you? Is this something that you want to hold on to for later? And I kind of let her make a decision if it was something that could be included in the story, how much she wanted to know about it, or how much she wanted me to kind of filter, for her, and kind of tell her what it was before sharing it. Also walking through what is not included, so we always have to make choices in stories. So talking about what we may or may not include in the story. With Sandy, one of the details that was really important in the story was that, is that she was in Cleveland because she had an addiction and she had been sober for years and she relapsed. So we talked about how can we share this detail about, the addiction that you have and put it in context so that it doesn't feel bad to you the way we're sharing it, but we also let people know that this is a part of the story, right? So we had a good conversation about how we can do that so that it would work. And that's where having another trusted person involved can help to get a perspective on how that will be perceived. One of the other examples of that was in the Johanna Orozco story. Her story was a teen dating violence story, but her family had a history of domestic violence. And when her family members knew about the story, we actually went through each chapter and what would be in it. Her grandparents and her aunt were like, absolutely not. You will not say that your parents had a domestic violence situation. They're both dead and you don't speak ill of the dead and you don't share their private information. And it had to end up being a group conversation. But ultimately, Joanna, was the one that needed to decide because it was her story. And she had this conversation with her family members that said, and she said, I never would have been in the situation where I would have seen that this was normal had I not seen it in my own family. And the only way we can share that is to share the whole thing. And I just want you guys to respect that. And they were not happy about it, but ultimately it was a detail that we left in the story, but we got to a place where everybody was comfortable about how it was described. So just talking about that editing process and we're walking through it with survivors and not holding folks to a higher standard. And then I just want to quickly wrap up by talking about aftermath. We often stop telling a story where the justice system ends, and that is not the right frame because I don't know a single survivor, either if it's a family member that has lived with the loss of a loved one or a sexual assault survivor, who the second the justice system, if they even participated in it, was over, that we're like, okay, that's done, moving on to my life. So taking more time to talk about aftermath. Including even when we do our stories, I always like to share this picture of Sandy, who one day we invite survivors into the process of reporting. Sandy actually came to our printing plant the day that we printed her story. She was so curious. She talked to the press people who were actually printing the paper about how it worked, asked them questions, was able to hold and see her story before it was actually put on trucks and delivered to people. It was such a meaningful part of the process because it wasn't something she was kept out of. She didn't get to pick the photo and pick the colors, but she got to see each of the pieces as they went together. And for her, when we were talking about it, she later described that as like really important in putting her own narrative back together. It was like as if each piece of the story came together, her own ability to tell the story and understand the story came together as well, down to actually being able to hand it out to folks from her own hand. So thank you. Sorry, I